FBI Director Kash Patel sat completely frozen during 92 seconds of absolute silence. And here is exactly why. Based on official statements from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the excursion to Milan was classified as formal government business. It featured critical meetings with international law enforcement partners and strategic coordination with allied agencies. This is the specific type of diplomatic and security assignment that fully justifies putting the director of the FBI on a taxpayer-funded government jet and flying him all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. However, according to photographs captured that exact same evening, the director of the FBI was actually standing inside the Team USA hockey locker room. He was holding a beer, while a gold medal hung casually around his neck. Both of those conflicting narratives currently exist in the public record. Both of them simply cannot comfortably exist together, and that glaring contradiction is where this story truly begins. Because what unfolded inside the hearing chamber of the House Homeland Security Committee was absolutely not a routine congressional exchange regarding travel reimbursements or scheduling logistics. This was not the typical kind of hearing where lawmakers read prepared statements, witnesses deliver highly cautious answers, and the entire exercise simply ends with polite applause in an empty hallway. This was a profound moment where hard documentation met total silence. Specifically, 92 seconds of dead silence. 92 seconds spanning from the exact moment Congressman Benny Thompson placed a printed legal complaint on the witness table to the moment FBI Director Kash Patel stopped speaking entirely. He pressed both hands flat against the wood in front of him and just sat there, while his attorney attempted twice to intervene and failed twice to rescue the moment. 92 seconds may not sound like a terribly long time when you are just reading it on a screen, but inside a packed congressional hearing room, with cameras rolling and microphones live, it feels like an absolute eternity. To truly understand why those 92 seconds mattered so much, you have to understand what specific document Congressman Thompson brought with him that morning. You also need to know why it was fundamentally different from every other line of questioning Kash Patel had faced throughout 17 months of congressional hearings. The document did not originate from a rival political campaign. It did not come from an opposition research firm. It did not come from a competing member of Congress desperately looking for a viral internet clip. It arrived directly from the Campaign Legal Center, a fiercely nonpartisan legal organization that has spent decades filing serious oversight complaints against powerful officials from both major political parties. This organization has actively sued Democrats and Republicans, cabinet secretaries and campaign committees, members of Congress, and entire presidential administrations. Their reputation inside Washington is incredibly straightforward. When they file a complaint, they file it with the hard documentation. Exactly 4 days prior to this hearing, the Campaign Legal Center submitted a massive 34-page legal complaint to the U.S. Department of Justice Office of the Inspector General. That filing was not a mere press statement. It was not an empty political accusation. It was a formal trigger under strict federal oversight rules. Whenever the Inspector General receives a complaint of that magnitude, the office is legally required to log it, heavily evaluate it, and determine whether it actually warrants a full investigation. It instantly creates a paper trail inside the Department of Justice that cannot simply be ignored or quietly archived away. That is the exact document Benny Thompson carried into the committee space. And the complaint contained something that forces investigators to pay close attention: receipts. 10 of them, to be exact. 10 fully documented flights taken by the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation utilizing taxpayer-funded aircraft. 10 specific trips that the document explicitly describes as personal travel, for which reimbursement either never occurred, failed to match the actual operational cost of the aircraft, or raised severe questions regarding whether federal travel regulations were properly followed. Now, if you have ever watched congressional hearings before, You know exactly how these interactions usually go down. A lawmaker asks a question. A witness responds with a carefully phrased explanation about regulations and procedures. Staff lawyers quickly exchange notes, and the conversation slowly drifts into boring bureaucratic language until the television cameras cut away. That is precisely how most of the earlier hearings involving Kash Patel had unfolded. Whenever travel questions emerged, Patel always had a prepared answer ready to go. He explained that federal regulations actually allow senior officials to reimburse the government for personal travel at the price of a standard commercial airline ticket, even when they are flying on a massive government aircraft that costs dramatically more money to operate. That rule exists for highly practical reasons. The director of the FBI travels with armed security personnel, encrypted communications equipment, and an unpredictable schedule that cannot always accommodate standard commercial flights. Therefore, the reimbursement standard is calculated using the equivalent commercial ticket price. Patel had repeated that exact explanation so many times in previous hearings that it had become almost automatic. Commercial ticket price, fully compliant with all regulations, personal reimbursements submitted every single time. Whenever the question surfaced, the answer sounded exactly the same. That is, until this particular hearing. Because Congressman Benny Thompson did not begin his line of questioning with a broad, sweeping accusation, he did not open with a grandstanding speech. He executed something far more methodical. He placed the legal complaint directly on the table in front of Kash Patel without holding it up for the media cameras. He did not even read from it. He simply turned it face up so that the bold header was perfectly visible. Campaign Legal Center complaint to the DOJ Inspector General, March 4, 2026. Subject FBI Director Kash Patel, personal travel on government aircraft. Then, Thompson looked directly at Patel and stated something incredibly simple. Director, I want to ask you about page 14. There was zero drama in his voice. No theatrical flourish whatsoever. That is simply the way Benny Thompson conducts his hearings. For decades, he has questioned law enforcement officials, intelligence officers, cabinet secretaries, and sworn witnesses under oath in the committees responsible for national security oversight. He does not shout. He does not rush his words. He asks his questions slowly enough that the person sitting across from him understands exactly what is being asked. And right there on page 14 of that complaint was a highly specific event. December 2025. A tragic mass shooting at Brown University. According to the document, an elite FBI evidence response team urgently needed to reach Providence, Rhode Island, as quickly as humanly possible, to assist in the massive investigation. Normally, that type of critical deployment relies heavily on Bureau aircraft when time is of the essence. But on that specific night, the complaint alleges something highly unusual took place. Both FBI jets were completely unavailable. One aircraft was already being actively used by other FBI personnel. The second aircraft was actively being held down in South Florida under instructions connected to personal travel by the director. Because of this, the Vital Evidence Response Team did not fly. Instead, they drove through a blinding snowstorm overnight, navigating across hundreds of miles of treacherous winter roads, simply because the aircraft they normally would have used were completely out of reach. When Thompson reached that devastating part of the document, he did not dramatize it. He summarized it calmly, and then posed one single question. Director Patel, on the night of a mass shooting at Brown University, an FBI evidence team drove through a snowstorm because the aircraft were unavailable. Is that account accurate? What unfolded next is exactly where the real timeline begins. Patel looked down at the complaint. His attorney leaned forward slightly in his chair. The room fell dead quiet for 12 full seconds. Nobody spoke a word. Then Kash Patel began answering. He claimed the sequence described in the grievance did not accurately reflect standard operational aircraft management procedures. He argued the FBI always ensures that crucial resources remain available for urgent investigative needs. He noted that the evidence response team ultimately arrived at the scene and successfully completed their work. Each sentence sounded incredibly careful. Each phrase felt heavily practiced, but Congressman Thompson was far from finished. He waited patiently for Patel to complete the explanation. Then he placed another piece of paper directly on the table. It was a formal reimbursement record. The file proved that Kash Patel had reimbursed the government exactly $218 for a journey taken aboard an FBI aircraft to State College, Pennsylvania. For a professional wrestling event where Alexis Wilkins, Patel's girlfriend, performed the national anthem. The specific aircraft utilized for that trip was a Gulfstream G550. The standard operational cost per flight is approximately $45,000. The reimbursement submitted was a mere $218. Thompson slid the paper right next to the formal complaint. Then, he delivered a statement that completely changed the entire tone of the room. Director, a previous FBI director, was fired for doing this. The historical reference was not subtle in the slightest. In 1993, President Bill Clinton dismissed FBI Director William Sessions after a rigorous Justice Department investigation concluded that Sessions had actively used government aircraft for personal travel and reimbursed the government solely at cheap commercial ticket rates. The controversy erupted into a massive national scandal, and now, 33 years later, that exact same historical comparison was resting right on the witness table directly in front of Kash Patel. 4 pieces of hard evidence aligned in a row. The official claim that the Milan trip was state business, a photograph from the Olympic locker room showing Patel celebrating with athletes, the reimbursement record for $218, and the whistleblower account describing an FBI team driving through a blizzard because the aircraft were unavailable. Congressman Thompson did not raise his voice at all. He simply asked the ultimate question. Director Patel, why did you do what William Sessions was fired for doing? For a brief moment, Kash Patel looked exactly the way witnesses often look when they suddenly realize that their next rehearsed answer cannot possibly solve the massive problem sitting right in front of them. He rapidly ran through the calculations, defend the reimbursement rule, challenge the validity of the complaint, dismiss the historical comparison. Every single option collided violently with the documents sitting on the table. So he opted for the only defense still available. Senator, Patel stated, my travel practices have been fully compliant with federal regulations, and I completely reject the characterization presented in that complaint. It was the exact kind of answer that might have easily worked in earlier hearings. But the entire room had already viewed the hard evidence, and that is exactly when the silence began escalating toward those famous 92 seconds. Because Congressman Thompson had one final piece of evidence left to place on the table, and this last document was the one that escalated a boring bureaucratic argument about travel reimbursements into something infinitely harder to dismiss. Because up until that specific moment, the discussion could technically still be framed as a dry technical dispute. Regulations, accounting procedures, and highly complex interpretations of reimbursement rules that most average Americans never read and never care about. It was still possible, at least in theory, to argue that the whole mess came down to a regulatory gray area buried inside the federal travel code. Then, Congressman Benny Thompson laid a 4th document on the table. It was not a financial receipt. It was not a generic reimbursement form. It was a highly detailed written account provided directly to Congress by an internal whistleblower, thoroughly describing exactly what occurred on the night of the shooting at Brown University. The narrative was devastatingly precise. It contained exact dates, timestamps, and internal communication logs. These are the exact types of details that seasoned investigators inside federal agencies recognize immediately, because they perfectly match how authentic operational reports are drafted. It outlined the exact moment an FBI evidence response team desperately attempted to secure aircraft support so they could reach Providence quickly after the tragedy, and it detailed exactly what they were explicitly told: no aircraft available. One jet was already deployed. The other jet was actively being held down in South Florida. At that exact time, according to the grievance filed with the U.S. Department of Justice Office of the Inspector General, that specific aircraft was tied to the personal travel arrangements for FBI Director Kash Patel. So the team drove. They drove straight into a brutal winter storm. They spent hours on the highway in pitch blackness, while the snow rapidly accumulated along the roadside and visibility completely plummeted. It happened the exact way it does in massive northeastern storms, where the freezing wind morphs falling snow into a blinding wall of white that devours vehicle headlights. By the time they finally reached Providence the following morning, the active investigation had already begun without their presence. Now, I want you to picture that specific scene for a moment, because this is exactly where the hearing stopped being about jet fuel costs and started becoming about something else entirely. Inside a warm hearing room in Washington, a sitting director of the FBI was aggressively defending travel reimbursements that totaled $218 for a ride on an aircraft that burns $45,000 to operate. Outside of Washington, somewhere on a freezing interstate in the middle of a massive snowstorm months earlier, dedicated federal investigators were driving through the night because the aircraft they would normally rely upon were completely unavailable to them. That brutal contrast did not require any fancy rhetorical embellishment. It was already crystal clear in the documents. And that is the exact moment Congressman Thompson pivoted the hearing from dry technical oversight into devastating prosecutorial logic. He did not point fingers. He did not editorialize the situation. He simply stacked the heavy evidence again. First, the complaint filed by the Campaign Legal Center describing 10 personal trips taken on government aircraft. Second, the reimbursement record proving $218 was returned to the government for one of those expensive flights. Third, the historical precedent involving former FBI Director William Sessions, who was dismissed for using bureau planes for personal travel while reimbursing only at basic commercial ticket rates. And fourth, the detailed whistleblower account from the delayed Brown University response, 4 documents in a perfect line, 4 pieces of paper that together formed a narrative that no political speech could ever improve. If you watched the hearing live on television, you could clearly see the exact moment when Kash Patel fully realized the conversation had violently moved beyond simple travel policy and into something infinitely more dangerous. Because what Thompson had brilliantly constructed was not just a basic timeline. It was a profound moral comparison. Sitting on one side of the table was the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, dryly explaining technical reimbursement rules. Sitting on the other side of the table was the powerful image of investigators battling a blizzard to reach the aftermath of a mass shooting. And when those two realities violently collide in a congressional hearing, the core question completely changes. It is no longer simply, did the paperwork technically follow the exact regulation? It becomes, what did that decision actually mean out in the real world? Congressman Thompson deeply understood that critical distinction. For decades, he has operated on committees responsible for national security oversight, and those specific committees function under a core principle that seasoned prosecutors recognize instantly: context absolutely matters. A policy that appears perfectly legal in total isolation can look incredibly different when placed next to the real-world consequences of how it was actively used. So Thompson coldly returned to the central issue again. "Director Patel," he stated, The reimbursement record shows $218. He paused deliberately. The operational cost of that aircraft is approximately $45,000. Another heavy pause. Do you truly believe that reimbursement reflects the real cost of that flight to the American taxpayer? Now, this is exactly where the internal contradiction inside Patel's earlier defenses finally began to completely collapse, because throughout all previous hearings, he had leaned heavily on one single explanation. Federal regulations demand reimbursement at the price of a basic commercial ticket, not the actual operational cost of the aircraft. Technically speaking, that statement is completely correct. But the exact moment the Brown University incident was dragged into the conversation, the technical explanation started sounding incredibly hollow and incomplete. The rule book may legally allow reimbursement based on cheap commercial ticket prices, but the massive aircraft itself still costs tens of thousands of dollars to operate. And if that exact aircraft is locked away when real investigators desperately need it during a severe national emergency, the debate transitions from strict legality directly to executive judgment. That represents the massive difference between bare minimum compliance and actual leadership. Patel responded incredibly carefully. He rigidly repeated that his travel practices were entirely compliant with federal regulations. He heavily emphasized that the Bureau consistently maintains operational readiness. He completely rejected the characterization presented in the formal complaint. The words sounded highly measured, but there was something noticeably different in his voice now. The confident, booming authority that had easily carried him through earlier hearings had softened into something vastly more cautious and highly defensive. It sounded as though every single sentence was being heavily weighed against the damning documents sitting right in front of him, and Congressman Thompson absolutely noticed. So he expertly returned to the very first glaring contradiction. Director, he noted. The Bureau stated that the Milan trip was official business. Then he slowly lifted another sheet of paper. This specific one contained a high-resolution still image printed from a widely circulated video taken inside the Team USA locker room during the Winter Olympics victory celebration. In the shot, Kash Patel is standing squarely among the players, wearing a gold medal around his neck and casually holding a beer. The scenario itself breaks absolutely no laws. Nobody was suggesting that attending a fun Olympic event violates the federal code. But the picture clashed violently with the strict narrative framing the trip as official, serious law enforcement business. Thompson calmly placed the photograph right next to the reimbursement record, next to the legal complaint, and next to the whistleblower account. 4 documents all over again. Official business, Olympic gold medal, $218. A massive snowstorm. For a few long seconds, absolutely no one spoke. Not Thompson, not Patel, not the legal attorneys sitting directly behind him. That quiet was entirely intentional. In massive congressional hearings, experienced lawmakers deeply understand the devastating power of quiet moments. When massive evidence has already been clearly presented, speaking too quickly can easily dilute the final effect. Complete silence actively forces everyone in the room to look closely at the documents and draw the obvious connections themselves. And that is exactly what happened. The media cameras zoomed slightly closer to the witness table. Staff members along the back wall completely stopped whispering to each other. Somewhere in the quiet room, a pen completely stopped moving. Kash Patel stared down at the documents. Then he slowly looked back up toward Congressman Thompson. The entire expression on his face had fundamentally changed. Earlier in the hearing, he had worn the highly composed demeanor of a witness, confident that the conversation would safely remain within the boundaries of boring policy explanations. Now, that expression had tightened into something intensely analytical. It was the look of someone frantically calculating the massive risks of every possible answer. His attorney leaned forward and urgently whispered something directly into his ear. Patel nodded once. Then he finally spoke again. "Congressman," he stated, "I would request the opportunity to provide the committee with a full written accounting of my travel record and reimbursements rather than respond to characterizations from a complaint filed by an external organization." It was a highly tactical pivot. Ask for time. Shift the dangerous discussion away from a live television broadcast and into private written correspondence where safe answers can be drafted by lawyers. But that specific phrasing contained one single word that immediately drew Thompson's radar external. The Campaign Legal Center was actively being described as an outside organization, heavily implying a dangerous political motivation. And that characterization did not survive the very next question, because Thompson knew the deep history of that organization and he knew exactly how to completely dismantle that argument. The word external sounded completely harmless at first. It sounded procedural, almost purely technical. It is the exact kind of language government witnesses frequently use when they desperately want to suggest that a complaint did not officially originate inside the oversight structure of Congress. But Congressman Benny Thompson understood exactly what Kash Patel was attempting to do with that specific phrasing, so he shut it down immediately. "The complaint," Thompson replied calmly, "was filed by the Campaign Legal Center." He paused for just a moment, the exact way seasoned investigators pause before presenting the next piece of context. They have filed complaints against officials in both parties for decades. Another calculated pause. They are not an external political organization in the sense you are implying. It was a flawless, surgical correction. No raised voice. No wild accusation. Just a cold clarification placed directly into the permanent congressional record. And the reason that factual clarification mattered so deeply is because of how the actual oversight process inside the U.S. Department of Justice Office of the Inspector General works. When a massive complaint like this lands at the Inspector General's office, the protocol that follows is absolutely not optional. The office is legally required to document the filing, heavily evaluate the allegations, and determine whether a formal investigation should be opened. Even if the filing is eventually dismissed, the mere fact that it was submitted instantly creates an official record inside the Department of Justice, which translates to something incredibly important. This was not simply a partisan argument taking place inside a hearing room. It was the highly public beginning of a documented oversight process that would continue long after the cameras turned off. And Congressman Thompson wanted that harsh reality clearly stated in the record. So he grabbed the legal complaint again and turned to another section. "Director Patel," he noted, "the complaint notes that former FBI Director Robert Mueller took 7 wholly personal flights in 4 years. Then he looked directly across the wooden table. You have taken at least 10 in under 1 year. The harsh comparison landed exactly the way it was designed to, because Robert Mueller's long tenure as FBI director had become universally synonymous with intense institutional caution. During some of the most politically turbulent years in modern American law enforcement history, Mueller had fiercely maintained a reputation for strict procedural discipline, careful documentation, and an absolute obsession with the optics of federal authority. By placing Mueller's flight numbers right next to Patel's flight numbers, Thompson was executing a maneuver that was subtle but devastatingly powerful. He was actively shifting the conversation from individual trips to massive institutional standards. The core issue was no longer just whether Kash Patel had technically followed the reimbursement rule. The issue was whether the director of the FBI had demonstrated the basic level of executive judgment expected from someone entrusted with the terrifying authority of that office. And that distinction matters immensely, because the FBI director is not merely a passenger on government aircraft. The director is the ultimate steward of an institution that depends heavily on public trust. Every single decision made by that office is highly interpreted through the critical lens of credibility. When armed federal agents execute a search warrant, when prosecutors bring charges, when intelligence officials share highly sensitive information with international partners, they operate entirely under the umbrella of the Bureau's reputation for absolute integrity. That legacy is not written into any legal statute, but it remains one of the most valuable assets the entire institution possesses. And inside that quiet hearing room, Congressman Thompson was raising a question that went far beyond cheap travel reimbursements. What happens when the public begins to question whether the person leading the FBI is actively using government resources in ways that appear completely indistinguishable from personal privilege? The definitive answer to that question actually possesses clear historical precedent. In 1993, President Bill Clinton swiftly removed FBI Director William Sessions after a Justice Department investigation concluded that Sessions had actively used Bureau aircraft for personal travel and reimbursed the government using the exact same commercial ticket pricing standard that Kash Patel was desperately citing right now. Technically legal, but politically indefensible. The massive gap between those two ideas has consistently defined how ethics investigations unfold in Washington. Because the law only sets the absolute minimum standards, but public institutions survive entirely by adhering to vastly higher ones. Thompson perfectly understood that history, and he placed it completely into the hearing without any flashy theatrics. The same year Director Sessions was removed, he stated, "You were 13 years old." The comment was not intended as a cheap insult. It was intended as a brutal reminder. The powerful precedent had existed for more than 3 full decades, which meant that every FBI director who followed Sessions had been fully aware of how highly sensitive the issue of aircraft use could become. And yet, the massive complaint currently resting on the witness table aggressively alleged at least 10 trips taken by Kash Patel within a single, brief year. 10 separate flights, some connected to international travel, some connected to highly exclusive private resorts, some connected to repeated visits to hang out with his girlfriend Alexis Wilkins down in Nashville, and one highly documented trip to State College, Pennsylvania, for a professional wrestling event where she performed the national anthem. Every single one of those trips carried a specific reimbursement record calculated at the cheap price of a commercial airline ticket. $200 here, $300 there, figures that look perfectly ordinary right up until you stack them directly next to the actual astronomical operational cost of a Gulfstream aircraft, $45,000. And that is exactly where the relentless logic of the hearing began to violently tighten around Patel's earlier explanations, because strict compliance with the reimbursement rule answered only one tiny part of the question. It beautifully explained how the payment was calculated, but it completely failed to explain the lack of judgment behind choosing to use the critical aircraft in the very first place. That specific distinction might sound overly nuanced, but in massive oversight hearings, it usually becomes the entire case. Imagine a police officer who technically follows department policy while repeatedly making decisions that create massive, avoidable risks. Each individual action may technically fall within the rulebook, but the overall pattern begins to raise a much larger question about their basic discretion. Congressional oversight functions the exact same way. Overall patterns matter immensely, and Congressman Thompson had just flawlessly placed 10 of them directly into the permanent public record. Across the wooden witness table, Kash Patel fully recognized that the dialogue had finally hit a point where blindly repeating the same compliance explanation would absolutely no longer move the hearing forward. He stared down heavily again at the scattered documents, perfectly arranged in front of him. Official business. Olympic locker room photograph. $218. Reimbursement check. Brown University snowstorm. 10 trips explicitly listed in a complaint, now actively sitting with the Department of Justice Inspector General. The towering stack of hard evidence had finally become completely impossible to ignore. For the very first time since the hearing began, Patel executed a move he had rarely done in previous combative sessions. He completely stopped speaking entirely, not for a brief second. Not for the standard, tiny pauses that naturally occur when witnesses nervously search for the safest phrasing. He simply stopped, both palms resting totally flat against the table, his eyes slowly scanning back and forth across the devastating documents directly in front of him. His attorney nervously leaned forward again and urgently whispered something, clearly attempting to prompt the next safe response. But Patel remained completely silent. 5 seconds dragged by. 10 full seconds. 15. Inside massive Washington hearing rooms, suffocating silence of that magnitude spreads through the physical space exactly like a ripple through water. Members of Congress shifted uneasily inside their massive leather chairs. Staff members abruptly stopped typing on their keyboards. The packed public gallery leaned forward almost imperceptibly. Every single person in the room sensed the exact same reality. At the exact same moment, the powerful witness had completely run out of answers. By the time Kash Patel finally managed to speak again, the confident, booming tone that had heavily defined his earlier testimony had completely disappeared. What rapidly replaced it was something drastically quieter and infinitely more careful. "Congressman," he quietly stated, "I would welcome the opportunity to provide the committee with a comprehensive written accounting of my travel record and reimbursements." It was absolutely not a forceful denial. It definitely was not a logical explanation. It was a desperate request for time. And inside high-stakes congressional hearings, requests for time often act as a glaring signal that the immediate conversation cannot be successfully resolved in the room. Thompson stared at him for a profoundly long moment before slowly responding. Then he confidently closed the massive complaint and set it back down on the table. "I have no further questions," he simply announced. But the exact moment he uttered that phrase, the entire trajectory of the hearing had already permanently changed. Because those 4 specific documents sitting side by side on that witness table were now officially part of the permanent congressional record, and within a matter of minutes, they would aggressively begin traveling miles beyond the heavy doors of that quiet hearing room. And once those explosive documents entered the official log, they began moving infinitely faster than anyone sitting inside that chamber could ever hope to control. That is exactly how the Capitol works in the hyper-fast age of digital reporting. A massive scandal that unfolds slowly inside a committee chamber can violently spread across the entire country in minutes. Once the undeniable evidence becomes visible, eager staff members share raw transcripts with reporters. Journalists aggressively compare notes with legal analysts. Massive news desks frantically begin assembling, breaking headlines before the chairman even bangs the final gavel. By the time the session finally resumed its ordinary rhythm, the massive story had already successfully escaped the room. 4 documents, 4 images, 4 terrifying questions that simply could not easily be explained away. The official claim that the Milan flight was critical government work. The embarrassing photograph of FBI Director Kash Patel inside the Olympic locker room, casually holding a beer with a gold medal around his neck. The pathetic reimbursement record, proving $218, was returned to the government for a massive flight that actually cost approximately $45,000 to operate. And the devastating whistleblower account, thoroughly describing an elite FBI evidence response team being forced to drive through a blinding snowstorm after a mass shooting at Brown University purely because the critical aircraft were completely unavailable. Stacked neatly next to each other, those highly destructive documents told a glaring story that did not require any fancy commentary. They effectively narrated a brutal story about broken priorities. Inside the hearing room, however, the hearing dragged on the exact way these panels always do. Other members of the powerful committee still had their own eager questions completely prepared. The packed agenda still absolutely included major topics like complex border security, global counterterrorism strategy, and the Bureau's massive staffing levels. Congressional oversight is completely structured that way deliberately. No single viral exchange is legally allowed to entirely dominate the proceeding. The committee simply must finish its work. So, the very next member confidently began speaking. The inquiries rapidly shifted toward dry intelligence coordination. Statistics regarding domestic extremism were lazily read into the official record. Kash Patel gradually and nervously regained his composure as the conversation slowly moved away from the terrifying travel complaint and back toward familiar territory, where veteran witnesses can rely heavily on deeply rehearsed briefing notes and generic policy explanations. But the earlier, terrifying exchange had already fundamentally poisoned the overall atmosphere in the room. Because once devastating evidence has been flawlessly laid out in that kind of lethal sequence, everyone present deeply understands that the hearing is simply no longer just a policy discussion. It has officially become part of a broader, highly dangerous investigation. And directly outside the heavy doors of the hearing room, that broader investigation had already rapidly begun unfolding. Aggressive reporters immediately started comparing the timeline of Kash Patel's travel directly with the timeline explicitly described in the massive complaint filed by the Campaign Legal Center. Top legal analysts enthusiastically began revisiting the damning historical precedent involving former FBI Director William Sessions. Back in 1993, the Department of Justice formally concluded that Sessions had actively misused Bureau aircraft for personal trips while reimbursing the government only at cheap commercial ticket rates. The official Justice Department investigation thoroughly described that exact practice, using language that echoed almost word for word in the massive complaint now filed against Kash Patel, using government aircraft for personal travel, falsely characterizing the private trips as official business, reimbursing the government using a highly flawed calculation that absolutely did not reflect the actual operational cost of the aircraft. 33 years separated those two identical moments, but the terrifying pattern looked strikingly familiar, and that is exactly why the damning comparison violently began appearing across national news coverage before the hearing had even officially concluded. William Sessions forcefully removed from office following a massive ethics investigation, Kash Patel 10 heavily documented trips within a single year, cheap reimbursements calculated at commercial ticket prices rather than actual operational cost, and now a sweeping formal complaint actively sitting inside the U.S. Department of Justice Office of the Inspector General. The powerful Inspector General's office had not yet officially announced a formal investigation, but the legal filing itself virtually guaranteed that the massive issue would be heavily scrutinized. That is the entire function of the powerful oversight system. Complaints successfully create records. Records successfully spark questions. Questions aggressively trigger investigations. And investigations violently deliver consequences. Inside Washington, those massive consequences almost never arrive overnight. The massive machine operates incredibly slowly, guided by strict procedures flawlessly designed to completely protect due process and preserve institutional stability. But the highly public conversation moves much, much faster. Within hours, major commentators were already aggressively asking the massive question that Congressman Benny Thompson had quietly placed at the center of the hearing. What exact standard should actively apply to the incredibly powerful director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation? The absolute bare minimum legal standard, quietly written into federal travel regulations, or the profoundly elevated ethical standard historically expected from the powerful leader of the nation as most elite law enforcement? Agency, because the director of the FBI occupies an incredibly unique position inside the massive American system of government. Armed federal agents aggressively enforce strict laws against organized crime, public corruption, complex financial fraud, and severe national security threats. They aggressively investigate highly powerful people. They aggressively gather critical evidence. They testify in federal courtrooms, where the fundamental credibility of the Bureau frequently becomes the ultimate deciding factor in whether juries actually believe the government's case. All of that terrifying authority relies entirely on a shockingly simple assumption that the institution itself absolutely follows the exact same rules it vigorously enforces. When that fundamental assumption begins to crack even slightly, the massive consequences ripple outward immediately. Defense attorneys instantly begin asking much harder questions in open court. Foreign intelligence partners rapidly become vastly more cautious about securely sharing highly sensitive information. Members of Congress drastically increase the intensity of major oversight hearings, and the cynical public violently begins wondering whether the critical rules actually apply equally to everyone inside the massive system. That is exactly why profound moments exactly like the one that played out during those terrifying 92 seconds heavily matter. Not merely because a reimbursement record cleanly showed $218, not merely because an embarrassing photograph captured a gold medal celebration inside a locker room, and not even purely because an elite evidence response team desperately drove straight into a blinding snowstorm to rapidly reach a horrific crime scene. Those specific details fundamentally matter because together they aggressively create a vastly larger question about absolute judgment. Judgment in the ethical use of massive public resources. Judgment in the terrifying exercise of profound institutional authority. Judgment in the ultimate leadership of a massive agency that aggressively carries highly extraordinary power. By the time the massive hearing finally concluded, and the powerful committee chairman brought down the heavy gavel, the critical documents that Congressman Thompson had quietly placed on the table were already aggressively circulating through massive newsrooms, powerful legal offices, and fast-paced congressional staff briefings across Washington. The terrifying 92 seconds of silence had rapidly become the defining image of the entire congressional session. A powerful director of the FBI nervously sitting completely frozen in front of 4 devastating pieces of hard evidence. A congressman waiting incredibly patiently for an honest answer that simply never fully arrived. And a massive legal complaint currently sitting actively inside the Department of Justice's oversight system, quietly waiting for highly skilled investigators to finally decide exactly what happens next, because that remains the absolute final reality of profound moments exactly like this. The public hearings eventually end, but the massive records permanently remain. Quiet investigations aggressively begin. Countless documents are heavily reviewed. Numerous witnesses are thoroughly contacted. And eventually, the powerful system successfully decides whether what happened was merely slightly controversial or whether it aggressively crossed the line into something infinitely more legally serious. So now, the massive question officially moves far beyond that quiet hearing room. Which of those 10 incredibly questionable trips raises the most serious, terrifying concern? The highly controversial Milan flight, officially described as serious official business, while photographs publicly showed a wild celebration inside an Olympic locker room. The highly repeated, constant trips to Nashville to frequently visit Alexis Wilkins. The massive luxury hunting retreat deep in Texas. Or the highly terrifying night when dedicated investigators urgently responding to a mass shooting drove straight into a blinding snowstorm purely because critical aircraft were completely unavailable? Drop your specific thoughts in the comments below, because this massive story is absolutely not fully finished just yet. If you actually found this comprehensive breakdown incredibly useful, make sure to completely hit the like button right now so vastly more people can see it. Share it with someone who closely follows congressional oversight or federal accountability. And if you desperately want highly clear explanations of profound moments exactly like this as they aggressively unfold inside Washington, officially subscribe to the channel and turn on all notifications. The highly anticipated next hearing might already be quickly scheduled, and the devastating next set of documents might already be actively waiting on someone as highly important desk.